And now, please help me welcome our speaker for tonight. He is the historian for the Virginia State Capitol, and he's going to be helping us learn about the struggle that Virginia went through on whether or not to secede from the Union. So again, please help me welcome, we're going to make you a doctor too. Everyone's going to be a doctor tonight. Dr. Mark Greenough. Thank you.
Well, good evening. And I'm very happy this will be an indoor presentation this evening. I sincerely congratulate you and thank you sincerely for making the effort to come out under less than ideal circumstances. And we definitely have a quorum of the curious in this room. We outnumber the Senate of Virginia in 1861 with this crowd. And in 1861, the Senate of Virginia was bigger than it is today. So thank you very much. And with the quorum of the curious, we will jump into the issue of Virginia's political polarization and uncertainty about how to proceed, the struggle to decide for Virginia in 1861. And to start with understanding why it was such a difficult political question for Virginia to settle, whether or not to remain in the Union, let's go back to 1860. What happened in November of 1860? Yeah, we had a nationwide presidential election, and it's interesting to look at that election, and you see the political polarization of 1860 in the fact that how many people were running for president on the ballot? 4. In addition to the newly formed Republican Party featuring Abraham Lincoln, you had the Democratic Party, which had split into a Northern Democratic Party with its candidate, the Little Giant, Stephen Douglas, and the Southern Democratic Party with their candidate, John Breckinridge of Kentucky. And so there's 3 of them right there. You've got Breckinridge, Douglas, Lincoln, and does it ring a bell? John Bell of Tennessee and his vice presidential candidate, Edward Everett from Massachusetts. So 1860, Virginians go to the polls in very large numbers. Everybody's politically engaged in this looming political crisis. And by a narrow margin, who does Virginia go for? They go for Bell and Everett. And the name of their newfangled party gives you a good indication of Virginia's mainstream sentiment. What was the name of Bell's political party? The Constitutional Union Party. And Virginia's reverence for the Constitution and the old Union was very strong, and that is where they put a majority of their votes in 1860. There's an urban myth that Lincoln was not even on the ballot in Virginia in 1860, but he must have been because he got over 1,500 votes from Virginians, mostly in the northern and western parts of the old Commonwealth. But he did receive votes on the ballot in 1860. So that gives you a sense of the looming difficulties for the nation and for Virginia. Who's the close runner-up in the 1860 election? Who comes in second? John C. Breckinridge and the Southern Democratic Party. So let's move on to 1861. By 1861 January, with South Carolina leading the way, additional states begin falling off from the Union, as we know. And by February, how many southern states are represented in Montgomery, Alabama, in the Confederate Congress? It's provisional, it's unicameral. How many states? 7 when Texas belatedly got involved. So you have 7 deep south states, all but one of them have Gulf of Mexico coastlines. They're very low south. And they're starting to organize a Confederate States with a Congress, a president, and a written constitution. And there are 2 other interesting conventions going on in February of 1861. In that same month that the Confederate Congress is organizing in Alabama, what's happening in Washington, D.C.? It's the Forgotten Convention. It's the Convention of Old Gentlemen. Does anybody remember what was going on? Yeah, this is an inspired crowd. A lot of you are nodding your heads. The National Peace Conference is happening in February, and that was sponsored by Virginia and that part of Virginia known today as Kentucky. The Upper South, looking rather concerned about their geographical position, very close to the North and in between the North and the Lower South, they are putting out peace overtures all over the place. So with Kentucky and Virginia backing this, the National Peace Conference meets in February 1861. Who chaired it? Yeah, the 10th President of the United States, brought back out of retirement, John Tyler of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And so, Virginia's impulse is to find a peaceful political solution to the crisis provoked by the election of Abraham Lincoln a few months earlier. So we've got the National Peace Conference in February 1861. We have the Confederate Provisional Congress meeting down in Alabama, and there's a third convention going on here in Richmond, Virginia. Elections were held statewide on the 4th of February, and by the middle of February, they've convened. What in the world is that convention? Well, it wasn't called the Secession Convention, and there was no reason to think it ever would be. When you look into the Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1861. Now, I've got a lot of sort of tricky questions here. Some of them are not tricky, some of them are tricky. But let's start with this. Did the Virginia General Assembly vote on whether or not to secede from the Union? Be careful. No. It's commonly assumed that the Virginia General Assembly, elected by the voters of Virginia, made the decision on whether or not to secede. No, they didn't. They made a clever decision to punt. And against the recommendations of Governor John Letcher, who thought the expense unnecessary, the Virginia Convention said, the Virginia General Assembly said, let's authorize a Virginia State Constitutional Convention. We've done it before. We had one in 1829, 1830. We had one in 1850, 51, so it's nothing new. We'll have another one, and we'll let the voters cast their ballots as if they were voting for 153 members of the Virginia House of Delegates. And it's the same election format. Go pick 153 people to represent all of Virginia, which would be 153 because there's a couple of independent cities with their delegates and then all the counties. So you have essentially 148 or 49 counties in a couple of cities. And let's let them grapple with the question of whether or not the mother of states and the mother of presidents should leave the Union. And there were two interesting reasons to support having a convention, aside from the cost, which, there was a downside. But why would you want a convention to be making this heavy lifting decision instead of the legislature? I'll give you two reasons. If you are Virginia voters, and you've already voted before the crisis who's going to be in the General Assembly, you weren't choosing those people based on your assumptions of what they would or would not do about staying in the Union, right? So if there's a called election for the voters to choose people with reference to the supreme question of secession or no secession, that gives you a chance to handpick your local representatives on so weighty a question. And here's the other thing, and this is really interesting. Dr. William Freeling brought me into this understanding. Can we, the people, review ordinary acts of the legislature? No. I mean, once the General Assembly decides, it's a law until they decide otherwise. Can we, the people, review the decisions of a called constitutional convention? Yes. So this was a safeguard. By allowing the convention to grapple with the secession question, once they have made their decision, a popular referendum would take place afterwards, and the same people who voted for the 153 members of the convention could then vote whether or not they agreed with what the convention had decided. Makes sense? So they start meeting in Richmond in February 1861. Well, what happens with the best efforts of the National Peace Conference in Washington by the end of February? Yeah, it does not achieve a political solution to the political crisis, but not for want of trying. You know, Virginia played that national peace card to see where it would go. It doesn't go. And the Confederacy continues organizing its own independent existence as it sees itself. So what's the next tricky question I might have? How many votes were taken in Virginia on the secession question? Votes, plural. I can think, depending on how you define it, I can think of at least 4. At the beginning of April 1861, the Constitutional Convention, meeting in the Capitol, in the old House of Delegates chamber at that point in its career, they called the question on whether or not Virginia should secede. And what was the result? I'll give you the numbers. 90 to 45. A lopsided verdict on the 4th of April, 1861 by Virginia Constitutional Convention delegates. What's the decision? Reject secession. And that was barely surprising, because in the elections where everybody was running to be in the convention, they were putting their cards on the table to the voters. And by a more than 2-to-1 margin, people who elected to the convention in February had said, we are for the Union. We are for the Union under any conditions, or at least for the Union under ordinary conditions. So the Union sentiment had been ruling the day for about 2 months of debates. You know, Virginians can talk. Do you know this? Those in public office in particular, you know. And so they spent 2 months rehearsing all the reasons why Virginia should not secede from the Union. And they pulled out all the stops, and they had some very compelling talking points. And they were very successful for 2 months in preventing the secession of Virginia. 90 to 45. So a lot of historians ask, what would have happened if they had just adjourned and gone home? But they didn't, because events were swelling and growing and getting more complicated. And interesting to relate, nobody remembers this now, one of the many things the Constitutional Convention of 1861 did was send a committee of 3 to Washington, D.C. to speak to the new President of the United States, to see what his perspective on this political crisis might be, and to hopefully bring back some good news to their fellow delegates in Richmond that Lincoln wouldn't do nothing rash or hasty. Remember what happened to that peace feeler committee of 3 when they went up to try and get a read on Abraham Lincoln? Same thing that happened a few days ago. Bad weather. Really bad weather. And their transportation up to Washington, D.C. was delayed, severely delayed, and they were not able to get to President Lincoln at the time they thought they would be able to see him. And that will have interesting consequences. So, if I stop here, wouldn't you be confused? Because we know that's not what's going to happen. You know, something else has happened. What happened? Sumter. The sword is drawn. The die is cast. After lots of debate and talk, South Carolina pulls the trigger and precipitates America's Armageddon. On the 12th of April, 1861, Henry Clay's birthday. Irony of all ironies. The great compromiser Henry Clay had kept the Union together throughout his long public career. On his birthday in 1861, Fort Sumter is fired on. The following day, Jefferson's birthday, April 13th, the garrison at Fort Sumter surrenders. And on the 15th, what is the federal government's response? Call up the troops. How many? 75,000 troops. From where? Every state which is still in the Union. And in addition to all the states' usual suspects in the North, is Virginia still in the Union after the surrender of Fort Sumter? Yes. Is North Carolina? Yes. Is Arkansas? Yes. Is Tennessee? Yes. Is Kentucky? Yes. The Upper South is in the Union. And one by one, governors of these Upper South states are getting the same kind of telegrams that the governors in the New England states and Northwestern states are getting. We need your troops. Every state had its own quota. In Virginia's case, 3 regiments of infantry were expected to be provided to the federal government at once. And they would be, the federal government even deigned to explain the locations where those 3 regiments would muster. In the federal government's view, that should be in Gordonsville, Wheeling, and some other location. In other words, not Norfolk, not Richmond, not Petersburg, where we had large concentrations of well-trained Virginia volunteer units in the cities. They were looking for those 3 regiments to muster in the northern and more western parts of the Commonwealth. Well, why do you suppose? Yeah, where is the Union sentiment getting stronger and stronger as you leave Tidewater? Yeah. The further west you go and the higher your elevation, the smaller the farms and the stronger the Union sentiment in general terms. And so, what can we expect from, well, let me ask you this. See if I can find this quote for you. I'm going to give you a quote and see if you can tell me who said it. I am now, and ever have been, a friend to the Union of the States. I appreciate its value. I ardently desire its preservation. I would not rashly hazard its existence. A wise, prudent, and considerate course may yet save the Union in the hour of its peril. Who said that? Governor John Letcher of Virginia. When did he say it? In his inauguration address, which was published for the General Assembly's use. So you have in John Letcher a strong Union man who's getting the telegram from the federal government to supply 3 regiments of troops to suppress the unwarrantable political combinations in the Lower South. What does John Letcher have to say about that? I think I know. Oh, he's run off of the podium. He's disappeared. But essentially, this is what he says, speaking from memory. No! And not only no, what you are suggesting is not within the purview of the United States Constitution, nor the Militia Act of 1795. And any request made by the federal government for the purposes it has in view will not be complied with. And we will arm against you. And this brings me to the C word. What is the C word in the politics in Virginia in January, February, March, April 1861? The C word is coercion. A majority of Virginians were very happy to stay in the Union as long as it was voluntary, as long as it served the interests of Virginia. But if the Union would be cast as an absolute, unbreakable Union that can be kept together by force of arms, then a majority of Virginians were willing to reconsider whether they needed to stay in a Union that was not held together by brotherly love and mutual affection, but by the force of bayonets, which is a paraphrase of something that Robert E. Lee said at about this time. So, Governor John Letcher pivots in that moment after the 15th of April call for troops. And what's interesting about him is he's a pretty good poster child for a majority of Virginians in April 1861 facing the outcome of Fort Sumter. A majority of Virginians will pivot when it comes down to a question of, in a war Virginians did not want and tried hard to avoid, now that it has come, as the grandson of Thomas Jefferson put it, to paraphrase George Wythe Randolph, are we going to shoot at Southerners or at Northerners? You have to decide who you're going to shoot at. And then the same convention, on the 17th of April, 1861, the same people who had 2 weeks before voted 90 to 45 not to secede, took a second vote under new circumstances. And what happened? Secession. But hardly a slam dunk. 88 vote in favor of secession versus 55. 55 who are still opposed to the mother of states and the mother of presidents leaving the Union, even after the federal call for troops is levied on Virginia. And what's really interesting is when you look at the geographical disposition of where those delegates voting represented districts, there is a very clear pattern. I'm going to pass this around. On this side, you see two maps of Virginia, voting maps of the 153 delegates. And the map at the top is the no vote. And the blue dots are pro-union people, and they outnumber the yellow dots of secession people 2-1. And then the next map right below it, same people voting, you see that the yellow dots for secession now outnumber the blue dots for the Union. And there's a very distinct pattern to the geography of where that support is coming from. And about 2 years later, the pattern becomes explicit. This is interesting. Back to how many times do we vote on secession? Well, we voted twice now, haven't we? The convention votes no, then when the war breaks out, they vote yes. Then who gets to vote on the 23rd of May, 1861, on the same question? The voters. Remember, being a convention, their decision is referred back in a popular referendum for we the people of Virginia to second guess them. But I have to say, by the 23rd of May, 1861, there's so much water under the troubled political bridges that, for every person still clinging to the Union in the popular vote, there's more than 5 Virginians who are willing to secede. It's a fait accompli by the end of May. But it's very interesting to look at the geography of the voters in the May referendum. If you look to the Tidewater in south central Virginia and up north towards D.C., that part of Virginia is voting overwhelmingly for secession in May 1861. When you get into the mountains of the Blue Ridge and you get up closer and closer to Ohio, you have a 2-1 general voter margin against secession in May 1861. What you can see, the handwriting on the wall, is the future state of West by God, Virginia. Now, let's ask ourselves this question. It seems kind of a strange question. In the end, does it really matter whether or not Virginia decides to secede? All in favor of saying it mattered a very large deal whether or not Virginia seceded, say aye. Aye. Those thinking that it didn't make a difference in the world whether or not Virginia stayed in the Union, express yourselves. Okay, the ayes have it. Why? Why is that true? I mean, that's my vote. It did make a difference. Why?
Logistics, politics.
Politics, logistics, economics, industry, yeah, heritage, political pedigree, legality, all this stuff. And wait, let's start with the natural resources. In what will become the 11 plus 2 states of the Confederacy during the 4 years of war, where did you find either the first, second, or third most important source for coal, for pig iron, for salt, and for saltpeter, making gunpowder? Where? Virginia. From a natural resources point of view, You need Virginia just for those essential building elements of surviving in a war. Yeah, but it doesn't stop there. How about human resources? Where will the Confederacy get, well over 20 regiments of cavalry and well over 50 regiments of infantry and a lot of artillery? Where's that going to come from? The manpower of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And speaking of human resources, if you're going to fight a bitter civil war for the life or death of a new nation or the preservation of an old one, do you want Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and Jeb Stuart on your side or on the other side? Think of the leadership resources and all those people coming out of VMI. So from a natural resources point of view, from a human resources point of view, it makes a huge difference whether or not Virginia is going to stay in the Union. And there's more. Some of you were thinking more in the Richmond reason for why this is important. Where do you find, in what becomes the wartime Confederacy, the biggest textile mill, the biggest flour mill, and the biggest ironworks, and arguably the best protected shipbuilding center in the Confederacy, I wonder? Richmond. Yeah, sister city to Petersburg. Yeah. So the industry, the economics of it are a huge thing. And let's not forget this. When Virginia doesn't about face and leaves the Union under duress in 1861, what happens in Arkansas? They say, Virginia's out. We're going to secede too. What happens in North Carolina? Virginia's out. We're going to secede too. What happens in Tennessee? Virginia's out. We're going to secede too. And Kentucky tried a Switzerland move, proclaiming neutrality. That did not go well. Yeah. But Virginia precipitates, with her secession, a second and significant wave of the Upper South leaving the Union and joining the Confederacy, guaranteeing a much longer and more suspenseful war than may have otherwise have occurred. True? Yeah. So it's a profoundly important decision. And something that I hope that we can do in our time, thinking back on these momentous events, is to recapture the real and painful sense of suspense that everybody was feeling in January, February, March, April 1861. How many people in Virginia do you think in January, February, March 1861 would have predicted 4 years of Armageddon? Nobody imagined, almost nobody could imagine what actually will end up happening. And again, with the first 2 months of the Virginia Convention in session, was there any reason to assume Virginia would leave? No. Every reason to assume she won't. And so it's rediscovered this sense of, I don't know what's going to happen if you're alive in the beginning of 1861. The pessimists, like Virginia-born Winfield Scott, arch pessimist, said we're going to have a 2-year war. It mattered what Virginia would do. It mattered tragically. And she delayed, and she pondered, and she thought, and she thought. It was not a decision taken lightly. It was not a decision taken with any certain sense of the outcome. That's for us to look back on with 2020 vision. They didn't have it. Now, when Virginians codify in popular referendum that Virginia has in fact seceded, what happens in the convention is interesting. One by one, members of the convention living in the northern or western parts of Virginia, where the strongest Union sentiment was to be found, began either exiting the convention on their own initiative or being expelled by the convention as no longer worthy of attending its sessions because of their pro-Union stance. So your 153-member convention by the 23rd of April 1861 has shrunk down to about 80 or 90 survivors, reflecting the harder secessionist corps. Did anything of interest happen on the 23rd of April in convention at the Capitol, 1861? It's 5 days after secession. Yes? Who's this? Anyone? Do not say Edgar Allan Poe. Who do we have? This is Robert E. Lee. More or less as he would have appeared when he walked into the hall of the convention in the Capitol. And be very, very careful. Did he accept command of Confederate forces in Virginia on the 23rd of April, 1861? He did not. He could not have if he had wanted to, and he didn't want to become a Confederate commander. He walked into the state capital of Virginia to accept a commission from the governor of Virginia to command the state forces of the Commonwealth. At that moment, April the 23rd, 1861, Virginia is out of the Union, outside the protections of the Union, but she has not joined the Confederacy. She is an independent commonwealth between a rock and a hard place when you look at the map of a polarized North America. And there's only one image that I know of, done by a local artist, to capture the scene of Lee taking command of state forces at the Virginia Capitol on the 23rd of April, 1861, in a mustache, three-piece civilian suit, with about 80 or 90 members of the convention to receive him, and the governor, and Matthew Maury in attendance, and the commandant of VMI in attendance, Francis Smith, among others. And this is what we imagine it might have looked like when Lee made a choice to serve his native state. We'll pass that up. And to sort of finish up with my prepared remarks, once Governor Letcher has a commander of state forces, do you remember what happened later on that same day in the same room shortly after Lee accepted command of Virginia forces? Something interesting happened. In convention, a foreign ambassador walked into the room by invitation to speak to the convention, and he brought a letter of introduction from the president of his nation. Who was that foreign ambassador stepping into the Capitol right after Lee had taken command of Virginia troops? Alexander Hamilton Stevens. Who? Alexander Hamilton Stevens of Georgia. What's he doing there? And why did we invite him? Well, his letter of introduction is from President Jefferson Davis. Stevens is the vice president of the Confederacy. And he has been invited and has sought permission to address the Virginia leaders in convention at the Capitol. Can you possibly venture a guess what the nature of his errand might be to the independent Commonwealth of Virginia? In modern terms, he is a closer. What's the deal he wants to close? Why don't you all join the Confederate States of America? And he makes his pitch. He pulls out all the stops. He was perfectly chosen because in his own state politics as an old Whig and former colleague of Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Stevens in the Georgia Convention voting on secession, do you know how the future president of the future vice president of the Confederacy voted on secession for Georgia? Against it. So he's one of those reluctant rebels that Virginians find themselves emulating. He knew the Virginia mind, and he told Virginians everything they wanted to hear. Everything. He quoted Patrick Henry in the Liberty or Death speech in the course of his remarks. And he ends up with more than a wink and a nudge suggestion at the end of his speech in the Capitol. Here's what he has to say. Yeah. Stevens, speaking to Virginia leaders, we are looking to your union with us as a certainty. But in the meantime, before that union can be perfected by the action of your people, we think a temporary alliance or convention of the highest importance to meet the exigencies of the day and of the hour. The enemy is now on your border, almost at your door. He must be met. This can best be done by having your military operations under the common head at Montgomery, he says. Yeah, join us under the common head at Montgomery, dash, or it may be at Richmond. And then he says cautiously, I have no authority to speak on the subject, but I do feel at perfect liberty to say that it is quite within the range of probability that if such an alliance is made, the seat of our Confederate government will, within a few weeks, be moved to this place. Okay, speech is over. So what does the convention do? You instinctively know what the convention is going to do. Form a committee. And they put John Tyler in charge of it, because John Tyler, having failed in the National Peace Conference, decides he's going to represent Virginia and he's going to vote for secession and do the best we can. So Tyler and other members of the convention meet in private with Ambassador Stevens from the Confederacy, and they report back in short order that they think we should form a temporary alliance to meet pressing military exigencies. And next May, because this is the 25th of April that the convention decides to vote provisionally to join the Confederacy. But that is going to be contingent on the public referendum in May. So the people in May voting on whether or not we secede will also vote on whether or not we have joined the Confederacy. And spoiler alert, we did. And true to his promise, the Capitol moved with great haste. The executive branch was in Richmond by the end of May, and Congress was meeting inside the state capitol with Virginia authorities' permission just before the first Battle of Manassas, which is an interesting thing I can hand out here to circulate. After Virginia joins the Confederacy, she starts flying two different flags from opposite ends of the Capitol. Over the south end of the Capitol, where Confederate lawmakers were meeting, they flew the Confederate national flag. Over the north end of the Capitol, where the where the Virginia House members were meeting, they flew a Virginia state flag. The last Virginia flag to fly over the Capitol in 1865 has been preserved. It's presently on display inside the state capitol. It's an eyewitness artifact. Yeah. So I'll pass this around. Here is my concluding formal remarks, and then we'll open it up for hopefully lots of interesting questions and answers. But let me ask you this. By June 1863, we're going to need to update the flag of the United States of America. Why do we need to update the U.S. flag in June of 1863? West Virginia. An irony of ironies, just a few weeks after the redoubtable Stonewall Jackson succumbs to wounds and pneumonia, he technically will become a West Virginian by virtue of where he was born, in an undivided Virginia. And the West Virginians back in 2011 decided they were going to market, the secession of West Virginia as a tourism angle for the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. Do you know what the tagline was that they took out in advertisements in large newspapers to come see West Virginia in 2011? I'm not making this up. Come visit the only state that seceded from the Confederacy. Yeah. And so, many people did. All right, let's do this. Who has, and I hope you do, Questions, comments, interrogatories? Let's open it up. Sir?
Yes, you mentioned the geography and the difference with West Virginia, what was from West Virginia and Virginia. What role did slavery play in the debate on the interests like versus Tidewater and what would become West Virginia?
Yeah. The question being, what role does slavery play in the political debates in convention leading up to not seceding and then seceding, and then some Virginians seceding from the seceders to get back into the Union? Slavery was a constant topic of conversation in the Constitutional Convention of 1861. And what's interesting is, one of the things that happens on the slavery front in convention is never talked about. For years and years and years and years and years, one of the growing resentments of the Western Virginians was that the Eastern mega slaveholders got discounts on how their slaves were taxed as property. So, you know, if you are of the slave oligarchy in Tidewater, Virginia, you're not paying property taxes on the full value of your slaves. You're cutting yourself a break when you're making the tax laws. How do you think that felt to the average Western Virginian who was proud to hold up his hands and say, I've got two slaves, this one and this one? It was a source of real resentment. So one of the things the Virginia Convention does in 1861 is to say, okay, we hear you out there in the Blue Ridge, in the higher mountains of Virginia. We're going to start taxing our slaves at full value rather than discounting the tax. So hopefully you'll be less unhappy with us, with the eastern section of Virginia leadership. So how did that work out? It didn't change anybody's minds in the northern and western part of Virginia. And as that map shows, it's circulating around. To borrow a phrase, there was a certain northern politician in national circles who once gave a House divided speech, as you will recall. Remember? This country cannot remain permanently half slave or half free. It's known as the House divided speech. Well, it's a real important part of Virginia history that, unlike any other of the southern states that rose up in arms to defend themselves against a federal government's invasion, unlike any of the other states, including the polarized Marylanders, the polarized Tennesseans, east and west, the polarized Kentuckians, or how about the poor folks in St. Louis who in 1861 up in Missouri and St. Louis can enlist in the Union Army or the Confederate Army depending on what block they stopped to sign out the papers in St. Louis. So Missouri is divided. Kentucky and Missouri were represented at the same time in both the United States Congress and the Confederate States Congress. So think of all these states with these internal divisions and tensions and so on. All of that said, Virginia is the only one of those southern states to permanently become a house divided. And it's interesting to listen to the arguments. Do you know that many of the people arguing for Virginia to stay in the Union were slaveholders? What was their argument? There will be better protection for the institution of slavery if we remain within the Union in 1861 than if we roll the dice and break our ties with the federal Union. And what did they point out? Was slavery legal under the U.S. Constitution in 1861? Supreme law of the land. Was slavery supported by various federal statutes? Yes. Did the United States Supreme Court rule that slavery was a protected institution? Yes. So the federal courts, the federal government, and the federal Constitution were aligned to protect the institution of slavery, at least where it already was established. And so the pro-union argument from many slaveholding Virginians was, why do we want to leave that club? Who knows what we will inherit if we go off on our own or join the Confederacy? Yeah. And, if the Confederacy is a young government, the federal government wasn't a whole lot older. If you are a Virginian in 1861, and you're weighing your loyalties to the federal government, which under our Constitution at that point was about 73 years old, your other loyalty to the representative government, Virginia, that government had a 242-year history. There have been elected lawmakers representing Virginia for 242 years in 1861, and the federal government's been around for 73 years. Factor that. Yeah. Comments, questions, others? I bet there, yes, sir.
A couple of questions. One, building off of that, and knowing that the ordinance of slavery, I guess, is what ended up coming out of it, because it was an ordinance, right?
Yes. Yeah. Conventions pass ordinances. Legislatures pass statutes.
And there is a reference in the ordinance to the protection of slaveholding, the threat to slaveholding states. What effect does the population, the slave population itself, or the considered value of that have as far as the position of Virginia vis-a-vis its prominence and importance as well to the Confederacy, not just from arms and munitions and other natural resources? Is there any sort of evidence that the commission or Stevens and because there were several other secession commissioners going around to Kentucky and Tennessee and the Upper South, as it were. Is there any evidence that there was any pull to talk about the considerable value of slavery to, if you will, to the Confederacy to the South as an asset that they were looking at?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the Virginia Ordinance of Secession, and they may be gone now, but I brought copies of the Virginia Ordinance of Secession, April 1861, and they're not just resting their case only on the slavery question, although they are talking about the slavery question as the subject that precipitated the secession of the Lower South. And if you look at the secession ordinances of the Lower South, they tell you that we're worried about our slaves and we're seceding. But that's not enough for Virginians. When you read what Virginians have to say in their convention ordinance about seceding, yes, there's a grievance on the slavery question, which has led to this unprecedented crisis. But, well, hang on a minute. Let's just quote the people, on the public record. It's in here. Let's start with the first Constitution, 1788, for a more perfect union. Virginia's ratification came with a codicil, and I quote, in 1788, for the record, from Virginians joining the original federal union. Powers granted under the Constitution being derived from the people of the United States may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression. Note that if there is injury or oppression to the people of Virginia, they reserve the right to leave the federal union. It's in print as a codicil to the ratification. Let's go to 17 April 1861, the Secession Convention, and it starts off, the very first sentence, the people of Virginia, in their ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted by them in convention on the 25th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1788, having declared that the powers granted under the said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States, and might be resumed whensoever the same should be perverted to their injury or oppression, we secede. We told you we could, and now we're doing it. And for Virginians, what it really comes down to is, slavery has excited this combustible explosion of politics. And now that the Union is under hurricane pressures, swirling apart, what kind of union is it? Aside from the slavery question, what kind of union is it? This is how Virginians are thinking about it, very legalistically, actually, very constitutionally. Is it a perpetual union that can be maintained by force against the will of component members of that union? Or is it a voluntary union of sovereign states that can exit if they decide they are being injured or oppressed? And don't think only of slavery. In 1861, what has the federal government just asked you to do as Virginians? They have asked you to rise up, take arms, and start shooting at states in the Lower South. A requirement of staying in the Union for Virginians is you must shoot at Southerners who have seceded. What kind of union is that? So Virginians had, as a rule, a majority feeling, this is a voluntary union. We said so when we adopted it. And we voluntarily, with regret, having tried every other option, are now going to leave it. So what is the nature of the union? Virginians had a disagreement with the federal government. Yeah.
So what every other option did they try?
The National Peace Convention, the sending of envoys to talk to Abraham Lincoln to sound him out. And remember, I said something about that? They got delayed. By the time they got an audience with Abraham Lincoln representing the Virginia Convention, Fort Sumter had already been fired on. They had been woefully delayed beyond their expectations. So that there was no hope of getting any happy news from the Lincoln administration. And so they came back empty-handed.
That was the extent of their effort.
Well, that and voting against secession and spending 2 months in the published press rehearsing all the reasons why the mother of states and the mother of presidents should act to stay the hand of violence and, preserve the Union. The impulse of Virginia was to stay. And only after the price of staying in the Union became you must shoot at Southerners who have exercised their choice not to be in the Union, that's when they flip. But not all of them. That's when 2/3 of them flip. Yeah. They didn't rush into it. How many Virginians signed the Constitution of the Confederate States of America? None. The Constitution of the Confederacy was debated and created without any input from Virginia because Virginia was not in the Confederacy until after the Confederate Constitution was a done deal. So they were coming into it later. Oh, I got a trivia question for you. This is interesting. Speaking of constitutionalism, did the Virginia leaders in 1861 reserve the right for Virginia to secede from the Confederate States of America? On the 19th of June, 1861, dotting their I's and crossing their T's, and changing gears and getting into the Confederacy in full harness, and the Confederate president's now in Richmond, and the Confederate Congress will be coming in a week or two, and by the way, let's do some housekeeping on the ordinance front. I quote to you from the leaders of Virginia in convention who had chosen to secede the second time they voted. Get ready for this. The Confederate Constitution is ratified and adopted by Virginia with the distinct understanding on her part that she expressly reserves to herself the right, through a convention representing her people in their sovereign character, to repeal and annul this ordinance of joining the Confederacy, and to resume all the powers hereby granted to the Confederate government whenever they shall, those Confederate powers, in her judgment, Virginia's judgment, have been perverted to her injury or oppression. The same language was invoked by secessionist leaders to say, and by the way, if we change our mind later, Virginia has a legal out to secede from the Confederacy. Just for the record. Yeah. So, however defeated that philosophy becomes by Appomattox, until Appomattox, Virginia leaders in the majority had a very consistent view of their nature, their understanding of the constitutional union. They had this very consistent view that got overthrown and repudiated at Appomattox. on this, the other side of history. John?
I wanted to follow up on your line of questioning. Generally speaking, what else theoretically could Virginia have done? What else would we, looking back at the time, have expected to see? Continue to say your question, did Virginia did enough, but I'm just wondering generally among all of us, what else could Virginia have done?
Well, I'm not indicting just Virginia, I'm indicting the Union, right, as well. Where was the diplomacy in this whole time? Where, knowing that Virginia was so important to the Confederacy to the South, to secession, where were the Union people? Weren't they camped out in Richmond trying to keep Virginia in the Union?
Yeah.
They were?
Yeah. Two-thirds of them were in control of the convention.
I'm not talking about Virginia people, I'm talking about Northern people. I'm talking about Lincoln. What was he doing to keep states in rather than letting them go out?
Well, as far as Virginia's concerned, apparently not enough. Yeah. Yeah, no email, no Skyping, no instant messaging.
Did everything to make it, to trigger the secession. We did the one thing that people had warned them against doing.
Yeah. Yeah, the Union majority, this is a very important point. The Union majority that had run the convention to their liking for 2 months and had kept Virginia in the Union, they pull out their hair, screaming and crying, and they say, when Lincoln called on Virginia to supply troops without discretion to the federal government on the terms suitable to the federal government, that's when the Unionists lost their control of events, because to stay in the Union meant you would be shooting at your fellow Southerners in the Deep South, and that was a bridge too far for about 100 counties of Virginia. The other 48 counties end up doing what no other Confederate Southerners did. West Virginia got herself clawing and scraping back into the Union. No other Confederate state managed to get any part of itself back into the Union before Gettysburg. And, West Virginia's in the Union camp before Gettysburg. I mean, that's an amazing political event. Yeah, ma'am. To make the to militarize. Yeah. Well, if South Carolinians are firing on federal property, how can you ignore that? I mean. Well, in fairness to Virginia leaders, Lincoln should have been able to predict what Virginians would do when his Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, said, you're going to supply 3 regiments to the Federal Army to invade the Lower South. Unprecedented circumstances. No president had faced anything like it. Yeah. He's new to the office. He's new to the responsibilities, all the circumstances. There's no precedent for any of this.
Are there power levels, and I'm not in source, so I'm really asking you questions. Are there power levels who are economists? Are they landholders? Are they northern landholders? Are they southern slaveholders? Who would need to improve that kind of thing? What forces those?
I wish we could talk to him. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't there a lot of pressure exerted from so-called firebrands?
Oh, gosh, yes.
South that
Yeah.
we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, the fire eaters.
And that was a preemptive strike on something, wasn't it?
Right, South Carolina just decided, we're done, we're firing, and,
Lincoln really wasn't responsible for that.
well, I think the weighted opinion is that South Carolinians can take some responsibility for deciding to shoot on Fort Sumter. Yeah. But, and here's how the language translated in the Virginia political context. In 1861, if you are one of those rare out-and-out secessionists living in Tidewater, Virginia, probably, you were known in code when people were making choices who's going to go to the Constitutional Convention to decide secession. If you are, we should secede yesterday, you were, quote, a friend of immediate action, unquote. Yes, if you were, no, let's stay calm, let's see what Lincoln does, let's not rush to judgment, let's, play our cards calmly, we are the mother of states, the mother of presidents, Union is our first choice, maybe not our only choice, but it's definitely our first choice. You were known as the wait and see crowd. And when they convened in February 1861, the wait and see crowd had at least a 2-to-1, maybe even close to a 3-to-1 majority in the convention. It's not the secession convention. Only after that radical about face do we start calling it the secession convention, when it did the unthinkable. Sir. Why South Carolina? They pulled the trigger. Things blew up. They took federal property by force. And incidentally, the federal government had purchased that property. That is federal property. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what they did. And you should listen to the Virginia Unionists reacting to South Carolina's Fort Sumter stunt. And the wife of the presiding officer of the Convention of 1861 is writing to her husband, John Janney. John Janney is presiding over the convention. He's a Quaker. How do you think he voted both times on secession? No. And he and his wife are commiserating in private correspondence about those crazy South Carolinians, What have they done? Don't they realize what they're doing? How dare they? Remember what one South Carolinian had to say about South Carolina? Poor South Carolina. Too small to be its own country, but too large to be an asylum. Yeah, 2 more questions. Yes, sir. Right there, I think. Architect of the Compromise of 1850 was born where? Ashland, Virginia. Yeah. Well, see, South Carolina, seceded in December. They're the first one to cut the umbilical cord with the federal union. Yeah, that's right. Buchanan, James Buchanan, old buck from Pennsylvania, lame duck president, all this stuff is unraveling. And you remember his policy? It was very interesting policy, presidential policy, after the election of Lincoln, and states are beginning to secede from the Union one by one under James Buchanan's watch, because Lincoln is not inaugurated until March. And here's his profound policy. Secession by individual states from the Union is illegal. And as president, I am powerless to do anything about it. That's not very helpful. Yeah. Let me offer you one little tidbit and then the final question. This is a quote I wanted to work in. My favorite quote offered by a pro-Union Virginia leader in convention, published to his constituents in 1861. Get ready for this. In the Stanton Spectator, an open letter to his constituents from Senator Alexander Hugh Holmes Stewart, a very strong Unionist in the Shenandoah Valley. And he's arguing with his constituents why they should vote him to go to the convention. And he's explaining why he is opposed to secession in early 1861. And he says, I do not propose to enter into any elaborate discussion of the doctrine of secession or to point out all the disastrous consequences that would flow from it. It will suffice to say that it is a doctrine of New England origin. What's he referring to? The Hartford Convention in Connecticut during the American War of 1812 with the British, the northern New England states were proposing to gather in convention to decide whether they should secede from the Union because the War of 1812 was so disastrous for their economy and their maritime commerce. And, a fortunate failure to lose the war at the last minute, with a little help from Jackson down in New Orleans, made the whole point moot. So they all kind of went, never mind, and they went home. But, the doctrine of secession had been advocated by New England states, around 1813, 1814. And so Stuart is rather disingenuously or ingenuously saying, do Virginians really want to, to embrace a doctrine of New England origins? Yeah. Okay, we've got one more question. I don't know where. Sean, choose the last questioner.
I think this gentleman over here, I saw his hand up first, so we'll go with him.
My wife is hiding her face. I'll let you know where we're going.
I know the feeling.
Y'all from South Carolina?
No, sir.
Okay.
Massachusetts.
Oh, yes.
However, not really. No.
Can we talk about where the real beginnings of English-speaking America started?
No.
Math question. Which comes first, 1607 or 1620?
How about Thanksgiving?
I'll give Massachusetts Thanksgiving if they give Virginia the birthplace of representative self-government.
I won't give Massachusetts anything.
Oh. Pray continue. Yes.
That being said,
Yeah.
Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution of the United States specifically states that no state can come out of another state.
Without the permission of an existing state.
Not finished yet.
Okay. I know where you're going.
Exactly. Without permission of an existing state, and has to be accepted by Congress. And since Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the state of Maryland in order to ensure that he had a union
Majority.
above him,
Yeah.
then didn't Lincoln also, pervert the U.S. Constitution by accepting West Virginia?
That was a cabinet conversation, apparently. Long story short, if that's possible, this is actually a fascinating question. Get ready for this. Bunch of movers and shakers from the mountains of the Blue Ridge who are unhappy with Virginia's secession and are willing to get back into the Union however they can. They start plotting for the creation of West Virginia. And part of wanting to become part of the United States, one of the litmus tests you have to pass is to create a state constitution. You have to come up with a West Virginia state constitution. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But from the U.S. Constitution point of view, for West Virginia to meet the constitutional test of legitimacy, the ruling government of Virginia must bless a house divided. Now take a wild guess what the considered opinion of Governor Letcher and the entire General Assembly meeting in Richmond was about whether or not 48 counties could be removed from Virginia to go back into the Union to, what do you think?
I think it began with the letter H.
Yeah, it was a negative. So, the representative government and the executive branch of Virginia meeting in Richmond are never going to bless the division of the Commonwealth, ever. So, if you are Lincoln and you are representing the federal government and you just can't wait to get West Virginia into the Union, to weaken Virginia, what do you do about that? Starting in Wheeling and later on in Alexandria, a puppet government, I think it's fair to say, very small number of people, said, we are the restored, loyal government of Virginia. Our government, with Francis Pierpont as governor, and we've got at least maybe 20 or 30 something lawmakers in our General Assembly now. We can't touch the 200 plus lawmakers in Richmond, but we've got 20 or 30 something lawmakers, and we control 2 or 3 counties in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We speak for the entire Commonwealth of Virginia, including the western parts. We are the real, restored, loyal government, and we're meeting in Alexandria now where we can be protected. We, Mr. Lincoln, give you full permission to divide Virginia. Go to it, sir. So Lincoln says, I bet. And in those days, the cabinet had 6 members. When he asked for their advice whether or not this constitutional solution would meet the test, would this pass muster? Can we make this work under the understanding of the federal Constitution or not? You'll never guess what happened. He had 6 people to ask. Tell me. 3 said yes. 3 said no. And Lincoln's in the balance. And on the no vote, among the 3 no voters was his own Attorney General of the United States, who says, this is not going to pass water. This is not going to work. It's a fig leaf. It's not going to work. And in the end, Lincoln cast the deciding vote. I don't need to tell you how. And it's rumored that he said that, in a situation like this, he was in favor of secession if it was in favor of the federal Constitution, as opposed to secession not in favor of the federal Constitution. So West Virginia's in. And the little codicil to that is some of the leaders who were creating a new constitution for West Virginia to get her back into the Union were slaveholders. And as they were drafting their constitution for West Virginia, guess what they wanted to do? Protect slavery. Now Congress steps in. Remember, we need permission from the existing state government, and we need the blessings of Congress. And the Republican radicals in Congress said, what do you mean you want to protect slavery in the West Virginia Constitution? And, these powerful slaveholding would-be West Virginians said, well, why not? It's legal. That's how we want to do it. And Congress said, well, we'd sure love to get you back in the Union, but you're going to have to decide that slavery is no longer a part of any constitution of your new state. And 1 or 2 of these movers and shakers just quit and walked away. But needless to say, that was not fatal to the movement. There were plenty of other people who didn't care whether slavery was protected or not in the state constitution of West Virginia, and they said, don't worry, we'll make it work. And Congress said, great, and in June 1863, they're in. Can we agree that this is not a simple subject? Can we agree that Virginia was uniquely at the pivot point where all these pressures were brought to bear in ways that no other state really quite experienced? And with that, I once again sincerely thank you for your kindness in showing up.